السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على نبي الكريم وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Welcome back to Ask Eman. This is a show where you get to ask your Islamic questions, and you don't ask them to me. Alhamdulillah, I'm not the one to be answering these questions, but alhamdulillah, you answer them to a Sheikh, someone who's qualified to give you that Islamic guidance and just the general direction of any of those questions that you have pertaining to fiqh. Anything jurisprudential matter, finance, lifestyle, even lifestyle advice. Inshallah ta'ala, please do give us a call, and you can give us a call on two numbers. The student number we have is 0203 515 0757. You can even call us via WhatsApp if you're an international caller, 0742 239 8833. And you can put the +44 if you're calling from international students, inshallah. Don't forget to put that in. Ideally, you'd be watching this on the stream as well. So we've got YouTube stream, we've got Facebook stream, we've also got the studio television program. So you can also contact us and message us on those streams, and the team behind will inshallah be passing those messages across inshallah to my device, and I'll be posing those questions inshallah ta'ala. So without further ado, today we have a very special guest, alhamdulillah, Sheikh Shams Ad-Duhaa. Assalamu alaikum, Shaykhana.
Excellent.
Was that a good enough introduction?
Well done.
Yeah,
well done.
It's almost like a rap. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. Shaykhana, before we get any questions through, inshallah, I wanted to talk about, I remember last week we talked about this concept of learning Islam online, and we had a good discussion on that. I wanted to talk a bit more deeper, actually. You mentioned one point, I remember this vividly, you mentioned the fact that we need to be able to choose that which is verified, that which we can trust. But let's assume we've already found something like that. So we found something that we can trust, something that we believe in to be respectable scholars. Now, my next question would be in ideal sense, in terms of adult education, in terms of adults seeking knowledge, what advice would you give to just general people how to appreciate, what angle should we go to when it comes to knowledge, seeking knowledge of itself, once we found someone to be, verified?
Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So I've given some thought to this, having obviously been in the front line of this type of work for so long. So firstly, just going back to what we discussed last week, my main concern is really, yes, verify, but obviously I understand that the idea of verification, that there isn't a single method. There are different traditions of learning, different systems. If I say to you, look for a teacher with ijazah, that wouldn't be fair, because not every system of Islamic education in the world today puts that as a kind of, they front that as their main feature, as the main qualifying criteria. So if you're studying at an Islamic university, for example, like, it could be Medina, al-Qura, it could be Malaysia, it could be any one of these places, chances are you're not going to have, the ijazah thing is going to be something in the background. It's something that students pursue perhaps privately and so on. And it's the university's qualification that basically the students take. Whereas if you studied in a Darul Ulum in the subcontinent, then there's a bit more of a kind of, the two are juxtaposed. There's a bit more of a balance of the two. Right. The curriculum incorporates the ijazah as two essential parts. But yet there is a curriculum, there is a certificate at the end, and so on. What they call
Is there a difference between tazkiyah and ijazah?
There are two different types of ijazah.
Right.
So there's ijazah in tazkiyah, which is normally practiced in tasawwuf circles, under the tariqah format, for those people who kind of pursue that line, agree with that line. I know there are those who don't agree with it, but that is a world in its own, right? And the tasawwuf ijazah is completely different to the academic ijazah, to the ijazahs of knowledge.
Okay.
Somebody may have. It is possible in theory, and in fact, in practice, this happens quite a lot nowadays, to my discomfort. But you can have ijazah in tasawwuf and have no formal knowledge background. It does happen. It's not widely encouraged, but it does happen. So there are two different types of ijazah. Okay. One is ijazah in suluk, in tasawwuf, in spirituality, and in your ability to spiritually guide and counsel. And sometimes people don't have formal learning, but perhaps the teacher thinks that their informal learning is of a very high level.
Yeah.
Enough for them to be able to provide this guidance based on their own experience of personal development. But for the most part, ulama discourage this.
Okay.
Right? And they say that knowledge of Sharia is absolutely paramount for the person who is also a guide in tasawwuf. But we're kind of going into the tasawwuf and Sufi domain. In terms of academic ijazas and ilmi ijazas, the verification process is different in different places, and it's important to acknowledge that. Right?
Yeah.
We can't hark on about ijazas when the person is a legitimate graduate of an Islamic university.
Yeah.
Right.
Interesting.
So, but it's important. But that's still a background in knowledge, a formal background in knowledge. The main, what is the underlying common denominator here? The common denominator is sustained learning from teachers.
Okay.
That's the common denominator.
Yeah.
That's the main feature we're after. That is people who have taken guidance on a sustained basis from teachers.
From teachers.
And there are other alternative methods, and I've actually done some formal work on this on the research front, and it's very important to throw this in, and that is some people learn privately.
Yeah.
Right? They learn privately, and the thing to look for is have they studied on a sustained basis?
Are there like key indicators that assume that they've, like, for example, if they've learned privately, they may have memorized Quran and they've got an ijazah.
Yeah. So it's important that they have learned the core Islamic sciences.
Yeah.
Right. It's important that they've learned the core Islamic sciences. And
in those cases, that ijazah would be paramount of importance. Or not?
Well, yes and no. So it depends. Like I said, ijazah isn't something that is strictly speaking enshrined in Sharia.
Yeah.
Right. What's enshrined in Sharia, if you like, is the whole teacher-student dynamic. The whole idea of ijazah is something that came about later, a bit like how curriculums came later and compilations of hadith came later and so on. So therefore, there's originally ijazah is ijazah in hadith. It's really sama' of hadith, right? You hear hadith from someone. So in some traditions, like in the subcontinent, the only ijazah that anybody cares about and the only ijazah that matters is the ijazah in hadith.
Okay.
All of your other education is about qualifying to be able to get to that level, which is about 7 or 8 years into your studies. Some places 9, 10 years into your studies. Whereas in other places, in Asham and parts of Egypt and places like that, there is still a kind of thriving culture of book-based ijazah, where individual texts are studied with the teacher and you get ijazah for that. There is another parallel ijazah system, which is ijazah in qira'at, which we were just talking about. So it's important to understand all these dynamics, and in that context, say that what we really want people to do is at least see that the people that you're learning from, first of all, are known. Remember, I mentioned that for me, avoiding anonymity is important.
Definitely.
Don't learn from anonymous sources. Don't read from anonymous sources.
What about those messages you get from WhatsApp and
the principle is the same. If it's anonymous, who's it from? First thing you have to say, samulana rijalakum, right? What is your source?
And what if that source is a person who,
like, how can you not seek a source when almost every other day you're hearing about fake news, fake messages, false attributions, and stuff like that? It's rife now. Yeah. Right? So you have to always ask for source, never forward anything. But
what if you find out the source, for sake of argument, and that source is a person who isn't of that academic liking?
Then you have to verify the information. Right. It may be that it comes from somebody who isn't particularly a person of knowledge, but what they have sent is a legitimate piece of knowledge. Then you have to go to somebody who is authoritative and ask them, is this correct?
Because I feel like with the online world, it's there is no centralized like government as per se, or some governing organizations that will actually audit these channels, and what the people use those channels for is they say, well, I'm just a da'i, I'm just calling to Islam. But there must be a jurisdiction between where they must fall in line.
There's a lot of context that's missing for the ordinary person, the end receiver, the end user, the guy who's doing that Google search, going into even a well-known website. What a lot of people don't understand that the information that they're gleaning comes from a particular context. It comes from a certain epistemology. It could be a madhab, or it could be a particular juristic framework, etc., etc. You don't know any of that. You just assume it to be some kind of truth because it comes from a verified source. And the reason why you don't know that is because you haven't had any sustained contact with knowledge.
Interesting.
That's why you don't know any of that context, right? And you can't recognize it. So that's why this is like, for the most part, the pathway to learning, whether it's just asking a mas'ala, is people learning from people. That's it. The online world is great. It's a great resource. We can use it. But as long as we sustain that principle.
Interesting.
Right?
Interesting.
That the online world further connects us or eases our connection to people.
Yeah.
Do you understand? That's how we have to look at it. Right? We can never break that principle, the principle of people connecting for knowledge and through knowledge.
Interesting.
Right? The moment that the connection with a person goes, you're in danger.
Yeah.
Right? And it's a danger for which a person can be accountable. If all you ever do is Google search information, if you apply basic common sense, right, you would not do that in any other area of knowledge. In any mainstream area of knowledge, you would never do it.
I think sometimes before we take a call, inshallah,
what gives people the courage to exercise that kind of license when it comes to deen?
I think it's because we have things like social sciences and we have sciences themselves. And for example, I come from economics background, so like that's kind of that's a social science. And any social science, there is an element of I can research this myself, and the academic circles sometimes encourage that. It's not quite the same as a technical science, where, for example, like medicine or something like that. And so you do get people who apply those principles that they get from university and so forth, and then they apply that onto the Islamic sphere.
Not to get too pedantic, but religious studies as an area of knowledge in the mainstream academic world comes under the broad umbrella of humanities, right? But studying religion for devotional purposes is a completely different area.
Right.
When people study religion at university, or you do religious studies GCSE at school, that has a completely different purpose.
It's more historical, isn't it?
Yeah, that is to do with learning about religions.
Yeah.
It's a mixture of anthropology and social sciences and all the mixture of all of those things. Whereas religion for the sake of devotion is very different. Here we're dealing with truths. We're dealing with authority. Does that make sense? It's like studying. It's like studying, doing a PhD in a medical area and practicing as a GP. When you practice as a GP and study for that, you are entering into something that is hierarchical, has authority structures. It has legal implications. Lives are at stake. Whereas over here, souls are at stake. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you're entering into something that is far more hierarchical, where there is a requirement of obedience of Allah, obedience of Allah's messenger, obedience of the people of authority, who within whom are the people of knowledge, and so on. It's a completely different objective. Right, and that distinction is extremely important. People are losing that because of the popularity of Islamic studies in mainstream academic circles.
I can understand. So, yeah.
But perhaps we're going too far away from the purpose of today's program.
Sheikhana, for that beautiful introductory start to the show. We have one caller. Assalamu alaikum. Your name and where you're calling from?
Walaikum salam.
What is your question today?
I'm Erica and I'm calling from London. So I have one main question that has sub questions and then another question. So my first question is for example, what is najasa? So in my household, there are some people that don't adhere to obviously the Islamic means of eating, they eat maybe pork or chicken that hasn't been killed properly, and they might touch something like maybe the fridge or the microwave. So if I touch that, for example, object that has najasa on it, or something that's impure because it's not, killed properly, or it's haram, for example, must I purify my hands immediately? And if that gets onto my clothes, do I need to clean my clothes straight away? Is it haram for me to leave it without cleaning it? And if I, for example, step on something that I believe to be najis, must I take off those shoes if I want to, for example, mention Allah's name or recite the Quran? And my second question is I have a bit of a confusion about the meaning of one ayah in the Quran, in Surah Ma'idah, ayah 3. But Allah says in part of that surah, today the unbelievers have given up all hope of vanquishing the religion. But I don't understand what the ayah means. Does it mean that is it talking about only the kuffar of the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or is it talking about the kuffar now and them in the past? Yeah.
Thank you for that. Thank you for your questions, sister. That was very brave of you. May Allah reward you. Sheikh
We go straight into it.
Yeah, straight into it.
Okay, so Sister Jazakallah khairan for your question. My first recommendation before I answer your question, because it basically I would have to explain quite a bit about najasa and how it works, right? But my first recommendation would be perhaps take an online course on tahara and salah. It is a fundamental for people who for all Muslims, and even established Muslims don't know these rules well. But then, and they're not difficult. You know, take a short course on it, and you'll see that it'll all make sense. And if you want information on that, then perhaps contact the studio, leave your details, and they can try and help you, inshallah. Now, in terms of najasa, there are two types of najasa or impurity that can sometimes get confused by people easily. So one is ritual, which is when something is considered impure purely because Allah commands it, not because there's any physical impurity or because there's any logical meaning to that najasa. The only reason why we say it's impure is because Allah has commanded that it be treated so. And that is like the state of needing wudu. When you're not in wudu, you're in what we call in a state of minor ritual impurity. You have to make wudu. You may have no impurity on you. The same is for when you're in a state of needing a bath. It may be that you need a ritual bath, like the fard bath, but you have no impurity on you. Because here, it's ritual in nature. It's najasa hukmiyya. The question you're asking is about real impurity. Right, actual physical impurity. And here, I'm going to give you some rules of thumb to guide your particular context, because we haven't got time to go through all of the rules of najasa, right? Those rules of thumb are, firstly, that the removal of physical impurities is almost entirely pertinent to prayer, right? Because one of the conditions of prayer is that one's body, clothes, and place of worship is free of physical impurity. So therefore, if, for argument's sake, accidentally, unknowingly, you had some najasa on your hand in between prayer times, there is no sin, there is no obligation to remove it immediately, although, of course, it would be better. Who doesn't want to be free of impurity? And there is no obstruction to the dhikr of Allah, to remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to reciting Quran from memory and so on, right? The main thing is that you now have to make sure that as soon as it's convenient, you can remove it and you don't pray with that impurity on your hands. And perhaps you are careful to make sure that you don't cross-contaminate something else. You know, touch something pure with it. Not because it's haram to do so, but because you're contaminating it. Now, that thing has to be cleaned, right? And if it's sacred, then it could be seen as a form of disrespect, perhaps, to touch the Quran with impure hands or something like that. So that's really important, because that was part of your question, right? The physical impurity and being clean from physical impurity is about being clean for worship, being clean for ibadah, for ritual worship. And not all ritual worship requires purity. We're talking about prayer. We're talking about salah. Yeah? So therefore, other things could be done, even though, you know, like if you work in a stable, you have some degree of impurity on you all the time, of course, right? Of course, yeah. So therefore, that's you know, if you're a butcher, for example, and so on. As for you know, impurities, pork, as in the flesh of swine, is pretty much, according to all Muslim scholars and opinions, is what we call najisul ayn. It is something that is impure essentially, and therefore any fluid contamination. So if anything any fluid that is on the pork has come in touch with your clothes or your hands, you have to clean it. That is impurity that has transferred, but not necessarily if it is dry. And then that becomes the case, that becomes another rule of thumb for you for all other impurities. If your hands are dry, your clothes are dry, and they've come in touch with something that is impure but dry, then there has been no transfer of impurity, right? And therefore, there's no impurity in your clothes, there's no impurity in your hands, even though you may psychologically feel like washing your hands.
Yeah.
But there isn't a requirement, because the Islamic ruling is that at bacterial level something may have transferred, but that's not the point. The point is that our jurisprudence decrees that there's been no transfer, that we assume there has been no transfer. What that basically means that it's permissible for you to pray even though you may have come into contact with some dry najasa, right? Provided there has been no transfer of najasa, visible transfer of najasa. If there is no possibility of visible transfer, because it's invisible, it's a piece of fabric that had impurity on it. You touched it, it's dry, your hands are dry. There's been no transfer, right? Those are some rules of thumb that I think will help guide you. But we can't go into all of the masail. So therefore, if there's been something that has transferred, some fluid, something physical, that needs to be washed. If there's been no transfer and what you came into contact with was dry, use that rule of thumb. There's been no transfer of najasa, you're still clean. And it's only a concern when it comes to your salah, right? Other things, there is a degree of flexibility in terms of you don't have to clean it straight away, etc., etc. So perhaps if you're in an environment where there could be lots of najasa, when you make your wudu, you quickly get into something that you know is clean, right? And pray with that. Get your salah out of the way, you can go back into your normal clothes. That's one way perhaps to deal with that situation if you feel that you're in an environment where coming into contact with najasa is almost impossible, or is almost unavoidable. Okay, inshallah. I think that covers the questions, right? Surah Ma'idah, that verse. Today the non-believers have despaired with regards to yourself, from your deen, and therefore don't fear them, fear me. This verse is about the completion of the revelations about the law of Islam, about Sharia, right? It is not necessarily the final verse, right? But it is the final verse that makes after the conclusion of the revelation of verses about Islamic law, and therefore we would have to say that the context of that verse is about the time of the Prophet ﷺ. At that time, that at the time of the Prophet, this is like a bashara. It's like a glad tidings to the Prophet ﷺ that you have stabilized things, right? You have stabilized things. They cannot. Where you are now, that momentum cannot be turned around again, of course, right? And therefore, they have despaired with regards to wiping out Islam. They've despaired in terms of their ability to wipe out Islam. And if we stick to that principle, inshallah ta'ala, then there will be no wiping out of Islam until the major signs of Qiyamah. All right. So in a sense, by extension, if we think of it in that way, we can say that this is also true permanently. Right? Because while Muslims may be weak and politically there may be weakness, as for the wiping out of Islam, that is something that, inshallah, as far as we know from the prophecies of our Prophet ﷺ, that won't happen until the major signs of Qiyamah.
We have a few questions here from this stream. We have a few minutes left, by the way. Sorry. Assalamu alaikum. I was going through a book of manners with my 8-year-old daughter. We were covering ikhlas and niyyah of an action with regards to reciting Quran. She said to me, Mama, if we should only recite for Allah, then when you ask me to read for Baba and show him what I know, that's not for Allah. Should I not do it? So if you know when the mother tells her, read for your dad's sake, which is in that, should I not read Quran then?
Yeah, but but as a child, you should obey your parents.
Yeah.
And you should do that for Allah's sake.
Interesting.
All right. The point is, we should try our best to do everything for the sake of Allah. Right? Because then we will be rewarded for everything. Meaning all the good things that we do, we should try and do it for the sake of Allah, because we will be rewarded. That is not to say that if we don't have the intention, we don't do it. The effort here isn't to give up good deeds because the intention isn't there. What we're required to do is to try to make sure the intention is present in all of our good deeds so that we capitalize on the reward.
Also, that she mentioned that she was 8 years of age, so I'm assuming you haven't reached the age of maturity
if you, for example, so my advice would be that, or the response of the child would be that actually when we're taught that actions are by their intentions, what we're being told to do is not to give up certain actions, but to bring a good intention into all of our actions. So here it is don't, if your parents have asked you to recite, you recite because you have to listen to your parents, but you remember, oh, I have to do it for Allah. So you change your intention.
Okay.
And you add the intention of doing it for Allah so that you get the extra reward for it.
You can do both, right?
And also, you obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Also, you obey your parents to please Allah. So you can have a good intention in both.
Right? I find that's quite interesting, you know, if that young child had the wit to decide that. We just have a few questions, sorry, a few minutes left, in fact.
It's
1 minute left,
question.
in fact. So I'm going to see what question we could ask, inshallah. That's less than 1 minute long. Ustad, what time does Zawal start and does it end? Technically, when does Zawal start?
Well, take the precise time from the calendar, but in terms of how the calendar is calculated, how it's calculated on the calendar, Zawal starts, and or the Zawal isn't like a really small unit. It's not a minute or anything like that, right?
Yeah.
So Zawal is the period of time when the shadow of إذا كان فيء ظل كل شيء مثله. When the shadow of everything on all sides is the same.
Okay. Yeah.
Does that make sense? And roughly in our language, that means the sun is directly above you.
Okay.
Right? That's the time of Zawal.
Yeah.
So as soon as the shadow, while the shadow is longer than it's not Zawal yet.
Yeah.
And as the sun passes over and it starts to extend on the other side, Zawal has ended.
Okay,
and that's roughly in this country it's about 15 minutes.
Okay, inshallah. Barakallahu feekum, Shaykhuna. Okay, we apologize for that slight delay, inshallah. We will take a short break right now, so stay with us and join us straight after, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome back to Ask Iman. This is a show where you can ask your questions regarding Islamic issues, Islamic guidance. And we have a Sheikh who answers those questions and provides that guidance that you may need, inshallah ta'ala. So if you want to get involved, then by all means you can. If you're watching this on our YouTube stream or our Facebook stream, just post a comment, inshallah. One of our team will pass on the comment or the message, which we've currently got over here on this device. Or secondly, you could actually call us if you're brave enough, inshallah. You can call us via studio number 0203 515 0757, or you can WhatsApp call us as well. You can even WhatsApp message us as well. So it's 0742 239 8833. So those numbers, inshallah ta'ala, and those streams, you can all use that for your benefit, inshallah ta'ala. Today we have with us Sheikh Shams Ad-Duhaa. Just before the break, we had a question regarding Zawal. What constitutes Zawal? What time is Zawal in between? And inshallah, Sheikh will now clarify that question again, inshallah.
Yeah, so we rushed through that a bit. So Zawal is basically noon. On the calendars, mosque calendars, it's usually noon. And the way noon, the basis of that time is it's when the sun is directly above our heads, right?
Yeah.
And I slightly misquoted the Arabic there. My mind went somewhere else, but it's Fay'uz Zawal in Arabic. So basically either they calculate it based on when things have no shadow, or they have a shadow on all sides.
Interesting.
Right? So, and usually that lasts, it's the length of time is different in different hemispheres, but around here it's around 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Right. So that's that. You've got your timetables basically that pretty much tell you. But that's what it's based on.
Would you suggest? Is it sometimes like, for example, the first beginning time of Dhuhr before it starts? Would it be a good indicator to say that the last 15 minutes before Dhuhr, before the start of Dhuhr, that would be the Zawal time?
Well, there's two things in it. 15 minutes before Dhuhr is noon. Is noon time.
Yep.
That's the makruh time. Zawal is the moment it passes. So Zawal technically is the start of Dhuhr time.
Okay.
Zawal is the start of time because that's Zawal implies the movement of the sun. Okay. So when the sun is no longer above your head, but it started to move.
Okay.
So Zawal is actually the end of what people loosely call Zawal time.
Okay.
But really what we mean when people say Zawal time in that way, what they really mean is noon, when the sun is directly above our heads. And for that 15-minute period is when all prayer is prohibited.
Yeah.
Right. But strictly speaking, when Zawal is when the sun starts to move away again.
Yeah.
And that's when Dhuhr time enters.
Okay. Barakallahu feekum. Right. We have a few questions actually. Inshallah ta'ala. I will put them on here, inshallah. So number one is we have one from Adil Nisar. Can we pray on a bed if we have less space? So we have less space in the house. Can we pray on the bed?
The rule with regards to that, and I'm telling you this based on Hanafi fiqh, because I don't really know how the other fuqaha explain it.
Yep.
But they say that you have to pray on a surface that if you were to prostrate on it, it would feel your face, your nose, your body could feel that the firm surface underneath, something solid underneath. If you don't feel that and it feels like you're constantly sinking and you don't feel a kind of solid foundation, right, then that is not permissible to pray on that kind of a surface.
I'm guessing it would be permissible to pray in quicksand then?
Well, no, not necessarily, because sand is pretty firm.
Yeah.
But obviously not quicksand because you're going to sink. That would be dangerous. But my point is so a firm bed, but not a really, really soft one. Right? Okay. You should be careful about it. But a firm bed, or not something that's got layers and layers of layers of blankets and duvets on top, so that your face completely sinks in. You should feel like like there is firmness underneath where you're prostrating. Okay, so with that, I don't know what people's beds are like, right? So, and if my mattress is quite soft, so we would avoid praying on that, right? But for example, we have a mattress in my parents' house is so firm. Yeah, I reckon you could pray on that. Okay, so it depends really, but you need. I'm
guessing this is out of necessity as well.
Yeah,
mentioning.
But normally you should. Yeah.
Right. A follow-up question.
As long as that condition's met, it's fine.
Inshallah. Yeah? Inshallah. A follow-up question is: can we pray next to a mahram woman, i.e., a wife or mother?
Okay, so in jama'ah, outside of jama'ah. So if you're not praying the same prayer in jama'ah, there's no issue, right? You can. If you are praying in congregation, then congregation has its own rule. Meaning in the congregation, there's something called tertib al-sufuf, the correct order of lines. And here the rule is that the order of lines taught by the Prophet ﷺ was men then women. So that's what we're following here.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So if you're praying in congregation together, then at least she should either be directly behind in the line behind, or the minimum is that she has to be like a step behind, so that no part of the man's body is what's the word I'm looking for? Is opposite no part of the woman's body. Does that make sense? And that you'd only do that if you didn't have enough space for a second line.
Okay.
So that's as far as it goes, according to the fuqaha.
Interesting. We have one other question here from Sister Farhana. My father-in-law passed away recently. Can I recite Ayat Karima for him as tasbih? Will this benefit him in the akhirah?
It depends on, which ayah and why.
So I think that's referring to La ilaha illa anta subhanaka inni kuntu minadh dhalimin. That part of the verse.
Yes, because that's a famous dua.
Yep.
And as a dua, it can be recited, again, as many times as you want, right? Provided that you don't attribute sunniyah to that, meaning that if you just want to repeat it again and again and again, because it's a great virtuous verse and it's a verse that with regards to forgiveness, etc. The Prophet ﷺ spoke about it and so on. Then you can do it repeatedly, but there's no prescribed number of repetition that is described in the Sunnah. Does that make sense?
But will it benefit him in the akhirah?
That's a different question. This came up last week, right? That's a question of Isal al-Thawab. And I said last week that the question of the actions of the living on behalf of the deceased, or for the sake of passing the reward on to the deceased, outside of financial worship or worship that involves money, such as Hajj, such as Zakah and Sadaqah and so on, there's a difference of opinion about it. Most scholars agree that yes, if a person does an act of worship with the intention of the reward going to a deceased person, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give the deceased person the reward. Right? And this does not violate the verses that say that one only carries the load of one's own actions. لا تزر وازرة وزر أخرى. Nobody carries somebody else's burden. This is not although it might appear to be so, but it's not in contradiction to those verses.
Was that referring to the ayat referring to the Qiyamah itself, something like that, right?
No, there's a verse, that generally refers to people's actions.
Okay.
Right? And that nobody carries the burden of somebody else's actions. And sometimes people who are against the idea of others getting reward of action say that this verse is the asl. This verse presents the principle, and therefore everybody carries their own burden. But we know for certain that verse, the implication of that verse isn't absolute. It has exceptions.
So it's small.
Right, exactly. So for example, you can't assume that verse is without exception, because the financial acts of worship go against it. So the verse has exceptions. And the difference of opinion is simply on the basis of some people limit those exceptions and others extend it, right?
Okay.
And they will have their evidences for it. So it's a matter of, at this level, it becomes a matter of fiqh. Difference of opinion is legitimate. My job is to tell you that there's some difference of opinion, but the vast majority of scholars accept it. The vast majority of Hanafi scholars accept it. And for that reason, and I personally believe it's permissible. So if that's okay for you, then you may do it. It's fine.
We have a few more questions here. One of the questions is, how do we pray witr salah? Why do Hanafis pray different to other madhahib?
It's a matter of ijtihad. They process the evidences differently. Sometimes the evidence is literally different. So you have to understand how jurists end up with different opinions. Right? And there's a number of reasons. Sometimes it's actually because they follow completely two different hadiths that appear to be giving two clearly different messages. There's an apparent contradiction, and usually there is general guidance on how those contradictions are resolved, but sometimes fuqaha disagree about that resolution.
Okay.
You understand?
Yeah.
One jurist said, goes that it has to be resolved in this way. Another says it has to be resolved in this way. One argues, no, this hadith was before. Another says, no, that's not correct. So the point is that the Sharia accommodates these different interpretations. Sometimes it's to do with interpretation. It's to do with the meanings of words, right? That's not something we have to get into.
Yeah.
But all we know is that, I mean, for us, it should be sufficient to know that all these different interpretations are legitimate.
Yeah.
And for the sake of our sanity and for practical purposes for ordinary Muslims, you should pray according to how you've always known.
Yeah.
Unless you have been systematically studying with a teacher who's taught you differently.
Yeah.
So, for example, you grew up praying witr the Hanafi way, but then you ended up studying fiqh properly with a teacher who taught you differently because that's how the teacher teaches it.
Yeah.
And that's how he prefers it. Then you may pray according to how your teacher taught you.
Yeah.
But if that's not the case with you, then pray as you've grown up praying.
Yeah.
If you're most likely if you're Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, your parents are Hanafi, even though they don't know it, and you've been taught a particular way, pray like that. It's not a problem. But the reason why there's different methods is because witr is actually quite unique in that there are
both lughawi and
literally there are so many ahadith that mention so many different methods of witr. The witr in particular is one of those examples where literally there are different methods mentioned in the hadith. And some ulama actually are of the opinion that all of them are permissible. That you can pray in any one of them is legitimate and is permissible. Even though in the schools of jurisprudence, there's been, the fuqaha have tended to prefer. They've tried to find out what's the most reliable, what's the most authentic. Not in a hadith sense, but what's the most authoritative method in the sunnah. And that's where the difference of opinion comes from.
Interesting. I hope the people that are watching this can appreciate the vastness of the Sharia, even when it comes to Salatul Witr. The difference of opinions and where they all come from, which is the Hadith and the Ayat of the Quran, and the jurisdiction of the early scholars. We actually have one caller. Assalamu alaikum. Your name and where you're calling from?
Wa alaikum assalam, brother. I'm Faiz. I'm calling from India.
MashaAllah. What's your question today?
Yes, brother. Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you, akhi?
I'm fine, Sheikh. How are you?
Alhamdulillah. Hayakumullah.
Sheikh, my question is, I would like to know what does this two words mean in Surah Al-Isra, chapter number 17, verse number 13. It says, and for every person we have imposed his fate upon his neck, and we will produce for him on the day of resurrection a record which he will encounter spread open. And the next verse is, read your account, sufficient is yourself.
Sorry, Faiz, can you hear us? What ayah are you referring to?
Could you say that? Could you just speak a bit louder? Because I can't quite hear you properly.
Yes,
speak a bit louder, inshallah.
Yeah, sure, Sheikh. Sheikh, the verse says in Surah Al-Isra, chapter number 17, verse number 13. Verse 13. It says, and for every person we have imposed his fate upon his neck, and we will produce for him on the day of resurrection a record which he will encounter spread open. You got the verse, Sheikh?
Yeah.
And the next verse is, read your record, sufficient is yourself against you this day as accounted. So I would like to know what does these two words mean, Sheikh? Can you just explain this in brief?
Which two words?
Two verses, I think he's referring to. These two verses.
No, two words.
Two verses.
Oh, the two verses.
Yeah, so first one is وَكُلَّ إِنسَانٍ أَلْزَمْنَاهُ طَائِرًا فِي عُنُقِهِ. And then the second one is اقرأ كتابك كفى بنفسك اليوم.
That's fairly straightforward. The verses are talking about the presentation of our deeds on the day of judgment in front of us. So as we know, the first verse actually is speaking about something that's to do with destiny. Right? وكل إنسان ألزمناه طائره في عنقه ونخرج له يوم القيامة كتابا يلقاه منشورا. The point of the matter is that there's two parts to this. One is, on the day of judgment, our deeds will be presented before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Another element to this is that from pre-eternity, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows
Mm.
who will be those who will attain salvation in Qiyamah, and who will be those who will not, who will be punished on Qiyamah, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows it. And obviously that essentially people carry their fate with them, right, throughout their lives, and they live according to that fate. There is no fate doesn't force their actions, but the fate does essentially coincide with their lives. So broadly speaking, the verses are speaking about the hisab, about the presentation of people's deeds on the Day of Judgment, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will open up their book of deeds and will tell them to read it out themselves. اقرأ كتابك كفى بنفسك اليوم عليك حسيبا.
So this is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
And this is where people's crimes manifest on the Day of Judgment in different ways, right? One of the ways in which they will manifest is that people will end up testifying against themselves by reading their own book of deeds.
Oh, subhanallah.
And hence, كَفَى بِنَفْسِكَ الْيَوْمَ عَلَيْكَ حَسِيبًا. You are your own judge, right? No need for anybody else. You read what you've done and the crimes you have committed, right? And you are the reckoner over yourself. You are doing your own hisab, because what you're going to read is fixed. It's a fixed record. It's fact, right? Sometimes there are other examples of this, such as the example of people whose limbs will speak out and testify, right? And you know, people's skin. يوم تشهد عليهم ألسنتهم وأيديهم وأرجلهم بما كانوا يعملون. Their tongues and their arms and their feet will testify against them and say, well, this is what we got up to for this guy. So these are different illustrations of how people's evil acts will be presented on the Day of Judgment when the books of deed are opened.
Barakallah feekum, Sheikh. I hope that answered your question, Faiz. It's always good to have you on the show. Really do appreciate your questions. Sheikh, we have a few more questions here from the WhatsApp. How old do you need to be to start praying? And when is it needed for you to pray? So when is it wajib upon you to pray?
Well, you need to start praying when you're 7.
Yeah.
Your parents should tell you to pray from the age of 7. By 10, you should learn it properly, and that's when parents should become more strict, so that by the time you become physically mature, which could be as early as 12 for boys, as early as 9 for girls.
Yeah.
By the time you're 9, 10 years old, you should already know how to pray. You should already be in the habit of praying. And parents should start to become strict at that stage.
So there's a hikmah behind that hadith about,
yes.
So you practice.
About tell your children to pray at the age of 7, or command your children to pray at the age of 7, and discipline them if they don't pray at the age of 10. The wisdom behind it is to ensure that unpredictable moment when they may physically mature and their actions become their own, and they are accountable for their own deeds. If they now miss Fajr, they are accountable for it on the Day of Judgment. By that time, they already have the habit of prayer. They know how to, not only do they know how to pray in theory and in practice, but they are actually praying.
Would it be wrong to take that hadith, that period of time between when it becomes wajib, about 3 years, 2 years, 3 years, and use that for other things? For example, learning any skill, say 2 to 3 years would be that benchmark for you to get used to a good act, to get used to something good. That 2 to 3 years.
Not necessarily.
Or would it just be better just to keep
not necessarily, because it takes different amounts of time. But yes, here it's actually something that principally is a lifelong habit.
Yeah.
It's a bit like how we nurture our children to have their 3 meals from a very, very young age, right? We get them off their nappies and potty train them. We teach them many other life skills. And in order for them to become embedded, brush their teeth in the morning, etc., we teach them from as young as possible. And we acknowledge why, because these things are important life skills.
Interesting.
Prayer is so important that we begin early. And the idea is that we begin early so that not only have they learned how to pray, but have the habit of prayer.
Yeah.
I don't think there is any need to infer any educational kind of psychology. You could do, but I don't. It would just be it will be speculative if we inferred something like that.
True.
Right? Because the hadith doesn't imply that 3 years is how long it takes. It's
Yeah.
just saying start early. Right? And as time goes, tighten up.
Interesting.
So at 10, you haven't got any time to lose.
Yeah.
Because a girl could be maturing at that time. And a boy could be maturing in 2 years' time. Yes, if they don't physically mature, like start having wet dreams and etc.,
Yeah.
then they are mature at 15 by age. Right?
Interesting.
15 lunar years.
So 14 and a bit.
14 and a bit.
Yeah. Barakallahu feekum, Shaykhana. We have one question here. Are we allowed to I'm assuming it's a female asking this question. Are we allowed to breastfeed a child over 2 years? What is the maximum age to breastfeed a child?
You should start weaning them at around 2 years, right? The maximum, and then after that, you should wean them off as quickly as possible. And I mean, I haven't come across a fixed time for a maximum. The idea is that it should be around, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about 30 months, right? وَحَمْلُهُ وَفِصَالُهُ 30 شهرا. One should try one's best to have weaned the child off kind of around that amount of time. And if it extends a little bit, then fine. What shouldn't happen is a situation where there is no attempt to wean. It's a child, it's a baby. You are going to wean them off. It's not rocket science, right? So therefore, beyond 30 months, beyond 2 years, there shouldn't be an attitude in a parent that I'm not going to wean the child off. I'm not going to make any attempt to wean the child off. Any parent that is attempting to wean a child off at 2 years, right, is going to wean them off. I guess that's the reason why the fuqaha didn't really, they didn't bother with a maximum age, because it's such a certainty. If you start weaning a child off at the age of 2, you will wean them off soon.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? If a child isn't weaned off, you cannot say it's the fault of the child. The child is 2 or 3 years old, right?
Yeah.
It's not the fault of the child, it's the fault of the parent.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So if a parent is attempting to wean the child off, they will wean that child off soon. Soon is enough. Soon is good enough. Soon after 30 months, soon after 2 years is good enough.
Alhamdulillah. Shaykhana, I'm going to have to ask you a very big question, inshallah, but we just have a few minutes before the end of the show. So the question is, let's see if we can try to answer it, inshallah. Is a UK student loan allowed? It has interest and only payable after earning over £26,000 per annum. If you die, it gets written off. But it's the interest that is concerning, because it keeps increasing as we go along. It's compounding. So university student loans, they can be written off if you pass.
Well, you've answered your question, right?
Yeah.
It's not permissible to pay interest.
Okay.
It isn't permissible to pay interest.
So then would the student loan be
It would therefore, that's why the vast majority of scholars say a student loan is impermissible, except for a minority of scholars whose opinion should be respected. If you come across that opinion, it's up to you, but make sure you follow it strictly. But there are some scholars who say, because education is a structural necessity, if all other methods of financing one's education fail, then rather than be deprived of that education, one may avail of this fatwa and take the student loan. So this is not a fatwa that says it's okay to take student loans. It says it's a necessity and therefore we make a dispensation. But you have to follow the kind of the structure of that fatwa, which is you have to attempt to finance yourself in other ways. If all else fails, then it is better to study with the student loan than to not study. What is implied within that is that what you are studying is a legitimate subject.
Has to be beneficial.
It has to be something that is beneficial.
Worth the investment.
Basically, it's something that you would deem a necessity. You cannot take a student loan for something that isn't a necessity. Right? Even in your mind. If it's not a necessity in your mind, then that fatwa cancels out.
True.
So yes, the majority of scholars say that it is not permissible. There are some ulama, Sheikh Qardawi and the European Council of Fatwa and Research have given these twin fatwas, one about mortgages, one about student loans. The basic argument is the same, that these are structural necessities and so on. That's me. I'm paraphrasing the details of the fatwa.
Of course.
However, there are conditions. Those conditions have to be followed. And when it comes to student loans, it's not blanket, right?
Yeah.
Because it's on the basis of necessity. You can't take a student loan for a subject that even you don't deem a necessity.
Interesting.
Okay, inshallah.
Inshallah, barakallahu feekum. One thing that's interesting to me is that from this fatwa, because this question is asked a lot, and I feel like as a community we've become a bit more mature about how serious riba is. I think when I'm growing up as young people, we didn't really see the problem of riba because we're living in riba-based society. So it's good to see that the ulama are trying to be as stringent as trying to be as like.
To be fair to the ulama, they were more strict before.
They were more strict.
They have always been strict. They were more strict before. There were no exceptions. So there was consensus when it comes to these kind of things.
Interesting.
There have been some because over time Muslims in the West have settled. Some ulama have considered this idea of, well, they can't just carry on not availing themselves of services that are there for them to be able to settle in these countries. They're going to end up badly inconvenienced. And for that reason, basically, they've made these exceptions. However, those fatwa have to be followed strictly.
Yeah.
According to, I'm not going to go into the details of that, according to what the advice is. Some people think there's an opinion, so I'm just going to do it. No, not like that.
Barakallahu feekum, Sheikh.
Okay, inshallah.
Thank you very much.
I can tell from your face that time is right now.
Alhamdulillah, Jazak khair. Sheikhana, thank you so much for joining in today on a wonderful Ask Eman show with Sheikh Shams Ad-Duhaa. I enjoyed it personally, and I hope you guys enjoyed it too. See you guys soon, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.